Welcome to the third annual Ronald Lecture, made possible by a gift to the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences by ISU alum Patricia Phobes Ronald. My name is Bill Simpkins, and I am chair of the Ronald Lecture Committee in the Department of Geological and Atmospheric Sciences. And before I tell you more about tonight's speaker, Dr. Nancy Rabelais, I'd like to recognize some individuals that helped make this event possible. First, I'd like to acknowledge the Dean of our college, Beata Schmidtman, who's there, and she's waving. You can clap if you'd like, Bill. And also the Associate Dean of the college, Bill Gutowski, who's also here. Michael Jens, who's the Executive Director of Development for the ISU Foundation, and also Angeline Hartman, both of whom are hosted in LAS, have helped to make this possible. And I don't know if either of them are here. I think they're on the road. And also our department's Ronald Lecture Committee of Christy France, Beth Casey, and Betsy Swanner. You know, okay, excellent. I don't see any other high-ranking dignitaries here. I can't really see. Oh, the chair of our department, Sven Morgan. Okay, fine. I'll catch that tomorrow. All right. The Ronald Lectureship in Environmental Conservation with an emphasis in water sustainability, as it is officially known, was made possible by a generous gift to the LAS College by Patricia Phobes Ronald, class of 1954, a graduate of the Sociology Department, and an admitted math and physics nerd. Trish was born in Council Bluffs, but went west to California for graduate study in human relations, which was apparently very successful because she met her future husband, Robert Ronald, and they now live in San Francisco area. She has always had a passion for conservation and water issues, mostly instilled by her father, Clark Phobes, and a passion for supporting and advancing women in science. As part of this passion, she was a board member of the League of Keep Tahoe Blue from 1988 to 2009, and in 1997, she formed the Tahoe Transportation and Water Quality Coalition, which brought President Bill Clinton to Lake Tahoe. This visit called attention to the potential for continued degradation of the lake and resulted in millions of dollars flowing into the area for lake restoration projects. Trish cannot be with us this year, but we sincerely thank her and her husband Robert for supporting tonight's lecture on shrimp and corn chowder. Okay, the 2018 Ronald Lecture and tonight's speaker is Dr. Nancy Rabelais, a professor and Shell Endowed Chair in the Department of Oceanography and Coastal Sciences at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge. She received her PhD in zoology from the University of Texas at Austin, and her research interests include the dynamic of ocean hypoxic environments, interactions of large rivers with coastal ocean, estuarine, and coastal eutrophication, benthic ecology, fate and effects of contaminants, and, most importantly, science policy. She's the author of 3 books, 34 book chapters, and over 125 peer-reviewed publications. Dr. Rabelais is most recognized for her research with the Louisiana University's Marine Consortium, otherwise known as LUMCON, and you'll see LUMCON referred to in her slides, which maps annually the extent of the hypoxic or dead zone in the northern Gulf of Mexico, the largest such zone in North America and the second largest hypoxic zone worldwide. But, as her lecture will demonstrate tonight, she is not a one-trick pony. She has also published on microzooplankton in eutrophic lakes, on human impacts on fisheries, and in 2016 with her husband Gene Turner on the biological effects of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. And there is some geologic context to her work in that statement. And she addresses implications of her science. Her recent review with the multiple co-authors in the January 5th Science edition discusses the problem of declining oxygen, or deoxygenation, in the global ocean and coastal waters caused by rising nutrient loads, which ultimately may affect fisheries and cause ecosystem collapse in those systems. Dr. Rabelais is active in state, national, and international working groups, National Academy panel, and advisory boards. She's received a ton of awards for her work on eutrophication and coastal hypoxia. In 2012, she was named a MacArthur Fellow. She is a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, a Fellow of the American Geophysical Union, a Fellow of the Aldo Leopold Leadership Program, and she's been awarded the Clark Prize of the National Water Resources Institute the Ruth Patrick Award of the American Society of Limnology and Oceanography, and numerous other very prestigious awards. So, one of the roles of the committee in this lecture series is to really identify women who are significantly advancing the science of water sustainability and environmental conservation, and may also be influencing science policy, and also have a fairly compelling personal story. I think you'll agree that Nancy Rabelais meets these criteria as one of the premier researchers on hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico and around the world. And she still loves diving overboard from a boat that is tossing around in the Gulf of Mexico, putting on scuba gear to do it, and recovering instrumentation in 60 feet of water and swimming around. That's what she loves to do. That's not exactly a cushy day at the yacht club in Florida. Before we begin, a reminder to silence all your cell phones. Please stay around for the question and answer period at the end of the presentation. And now please join me in giving a warm, I would say, welcome to Dr. Nancy Rabelais, our 2018 Ronald Lecture.
That wasn't 20 minutes. I gave you much more material than that. Thank you very much for having me here. It's quite a treat. I've been to Iowa State many times before, but never in this role. And I got walked all over campus this afternoon and my toes are hurting, but I think I can give them 40 more minutes up here at the podium so I can share my work with you and what it means and how we can actually maybe make a change in things in our world. So in shrimp and corn chowder, and you can tell this is chowder because it has some tomatoes in it. It's not shrimp and corn soup or shrimp and corn bisque. This is chowder. If it looks like this, it's shrimp and corn soup. And because it has cream in it, it can also be called shrimp and corn bisque. But those are the details you might not want to know. But this is a recipe of Don Ball, who was the first director of LUMCON, the Louisiana University's Marine Consortium, and I kind of stole this topic from him. But he especially likes LeBlanc's Cajun seasoning and Baum's sausage from L'Orange, Louisiana, for its smoky taste, and the LeBlanc's Cajun seasoning has not too much salt, but just enough so you can get all the other flavors out. But anyway, this is Don's recipe, and I'm bringing it to you because it brings two very different cultures together. It brings the high-intensity agriculture of the Midwest and the shrimp trawling industry of the Gulf of Mexico together in many ways. And we'll see how that works out. So there's environmental concerns and economic concerns in the Midwest of the U.S. And there are also economic concerns and social concerns in the Gulf of Mexico. And the two do not always mix well in a corn and shrimp bisque because there are problems with the water quality that the Gulf of Mexico receives, and it can be identified as coming from this part of the country. Let's see. So I consider this one big ecosystem going all the way up into Canada, through the heartland of the U.S., across the middle of the U.S., out into the Mississippi River Delta that you can see in this MODIS true color image, and then further out into the Gulf of Mexico. Now, this delta hasn't always looked like it looks right now. And the mighty Mississippi is what helped build this delta and give it its very rich resources and soils and wildlife and fish. It also swept across the landscape as it delta switched over geologic time. The present delta pretty much stabilized about 7,000 years ago. which is about the same time that many of the other great world deltas also stabilized. During the process of building this delta, and as glacier and ice on the continent came and went and raised and lowered sea level, a lot of the productive organic matter from this part of the country ended up in the Gulf and led to what are now very high oil and gas reserves. These are the structures in the Gulf of Mexico where oil and gas is mined. It's hard to see the shoreline here, but let's see. This is the shoreline, and this is offshore, and this is inshore oil and gas. Oil and gas development started in about the 1930s in coastal Louisiana, moved into the bays and estuaries in about the 1940s, moved offshore in the 1960s, and then now is going into deeper and deeper water, as that's where most of the larger oil reserves are. And all of these resources come together in this coastal water body, but with influences from far away, the deeper Gulf of Mexico, and from far away, the Corn Belt of the country. So the Mississippi River Delta, Mississippi River catchment, watershed, covers about 41% of the U.S., the lower 48 states. So it's a huge area. It covers 31 states, I think 7 EPA regions, countless precincts, parishes, counties, districts, water districts in Minnesota. And it all drains out through the Mississippi River Delta, south of New Orleans, or the Atchafalaya River Delta, not real obvious here. About midway, you'll see a better view of that. And offshore of that, that red area is what we commonly call the dead zone. I have the honor of being called the queen of the dead zone. And I know who to blame that on, but he won't admit to it. So, but don't worry about bowing when you get to meet me later. The area is primarily agriculture, the light green, some prairies and some forests, mostly second growth forests. And the red areas are cities and municipalities, some fairly big ones: Minneapolis, St. Paul, Chicago, St. Louis, New Orleans. But if you look at the overall landscape, over half of it is in agricultural lands, and very little of it is in cities. You know that you live in a rural landscape, unless you actually live in downtown Ames, Iowa, which probably not many of you do. So when all of that water gets to the Gulf from the river, it flows in across the continental shelf like this, and the fresher water is less dense and it sits on top of the heavier, saltier Gulf water. And in the summer, the water warms the surface, the sun warms the surface and makes it less dense, and the colder water that's saltier is more dense, and there's not very good mixing of those waters. If a storm comes through, a cold front, a hurricane, it'll mix up the water and mix the oxygen down. But it also brings in lots of nutrients, and we all know that nitrogen and phosphorus makes corn grow better. And nitrogen and phosphorus in the Gulf of Mexico makes phytoplankton. Single-celled plants grow much better. Those single-celled plants, phytoplankton, are essential to the productivity of the Gulf of Mexico. It's the base of the food web for all the small fish, the larger fish, the shrimp, the blue crabs. So it's very important. But if you have too much nitrogen and phosphorus, then you're going to have an overproduction of carbon much of it's going to get to the bottom, and bacteria that eat the carbon or decompose it are just like us, and we consume oxygen in that process and generate CO2. And that's how the low oxygen forms near the bottom, right here. And you can see these animals have escaped. This one's on the way out, and this crab didn't make it because it's not a very mobile organism. Fish and shrimp usually get out when the oxygen falls below 2, which is our magic number for the value that identifies hypoxia or low oxygen. And that's 2 milligrams per liter or parts per million. There's no good evidence that upwelling from deeper Gulf water affects the low oxygen like it does in other areas of the global ocean. And let's see, this is hypoxia 101. It's all in here. Okay, go on then. So this is what it looks like from space. This is the current Birdfoot Delta, the city of New Orleans. This is Bayou Lafourche, which is an old delta. This is the location of the Marine Lab, the Marine Center, Blumcon. This is the Atchafalaya, which carries about 1/3 of the flow of the Mississippi River and deposits its water in the center of Louisiana's continental shelf. And the red area in the map from earlier is this area here. It does extend well down into Texas, and more we're seeing it forming to the east of the river. The winds are predominantly out of the southeast. That pushes the water to the west and carries the dissolved nutrients with it. What you see here is a suspended sediment plume, which falls out pretty close to the delta, or to the land. And then a lot of it can get, into a gyre in the Louisiana Bight, and then a lot of it gets entrained into the Louisiana coastal current. So most of the effect is seen to the west of the delta and the expulsion of the river and the nutrients. So, and it also, the river, well, we know this, you know this, the river floods in the spring when high flow is, and low flow is in the summer. In the summer, the winds come out of the south and southwest, and it holds that what's not as fresh, or that much fresh water, onto the shelf, so you still have that layered system throughout most of the year. As I said, our definition of hypoxia, or low oxygen, is 2 milligrams per liter, or 2 parts per million, because if you put a bottom dragging trawl over the side, when you get below 2, you don't catch anything, or you haul up the dead crab. And also fish, bottom-dwelling fish, you don't get anything when the oxygen is less than 2. And when you consider the size of one of these areas in the middle of the summer being about the size of the state of New Jersey, then that's a large area where a trawler cannot make a living and can't afford the gasoline or the diesel to go further offshore to try to get into deeper water. So there's an economic issue involved here as well. I don't know if you knew it. You didn't know this. That I was a child prodigy. And when I was 15 years old, I started taking cruises on this vessel. And I've had 30 of these cruises, 32, 33, since I began my career at such a tender age. And we do one of these across the whole Gulf once a year. We have 2 lines of stations, the C, which is off of Cocodrie and has more of a Mississippi River influence, and the F off of the Atchafalaya, which has more of that river influence. And the amount of nutrients in fresh water and types of sediments and light profiles, they're all different in these 2 areas. So we have 2 more frequent, but not all the time, data from these 2 areas. And then we also, at the asterisk, we have oxygen meters deployed, which is when I get to jump in the water with my hammer to hammer off the barnacles and all my tool belt and all my stuff, so that we have one near the surface and one near the bottom. And that gives us high frequency data, but only at 2 locations. So that we can put this all together and combined with looking at what's happening in the sediments, have pieced together a very good picture of what causes and maintains the low oxygen offshore. These are just some of the things that we do when we're offshore. The oxygen meters, they used to look like this, but now they're attached to an oil platform. This is me just taking a water sample because I want to check the turbidity probe and I want to check the chlorophyll probe, which tells me how much phytoplankton is there. We have a large instrument called the CTD, and that stands for conductivity, temperature, and depth, but it also gives us dissolved oxygen, photosynthetically active radiation, transmission, fluorescence. I'm sure there's others. And we also take water samples from these bottles, just seen here. These are Nissen bottles. They go down open, and we take the whole thing to the bottom, and we pick depths that we want to collect water, like a meter above the bottom, halfway up the surface. And we can electronically trigger those bottles so that the top and the bottom close, and you get a known source of water from a known depth. We take a lot of those samples and fix it for oxygen so we can compare the sensors to the chemistry. We collect water for nutrients and chlorophyll. We also have, I don't see it here, a smaller unit that we put over the side that I can take to the bottom and can collect water near the surface to know what those differences are, because some of the gradients are very thin near the bottom and near the surface. And this is us getting mud and playing in the mud. Everybody who goes offshore with me gets muddy at some point. This is the extent of the low oxygen in the summer of 2011. 2010 was a high flow year, and so was 2011. We also sampled east of the river that year, and you can see how much low oxygen water is there. It's outlined by the dark line, and then how much is to the west, and I can't remember what. It was probably about 18,000 square kilometers. It's as large as now, since 17 was the largest, 23,700 or so. It's from very near the shore, or as close to the shore as the ship captain will let me ask him to take the ship, because he won't go any closer than 5 meters, which is pretty good of him. And to 30 to 45 meters offshore, depth offshore. And as you can see, on the western part of the study area, it extends pretty far offshore. It's not just this orange and red. All of this is less than 3, which animals start to be stressed, especially things like sharks and stingrays. They'll move out earlier. And it's most widespread and severe in the summertime. So we know over the years through doing lots of things that we know more nutrients are coming down the river. We know there's more phytoplankton being produced offshore because we can see the remnants of those cells in the sediments, and they've increased over time. We can see more carbon reaching the bottom. And we do that with total organic carbon and carbon isotopes. The oxygen consumption rates are higher. There's more hypoxia, and we can verify all this with paleo indicators. Now, these box scores take what we call paleo indicators. This is not centuries long or millennia long. These are over 100 to 200 years. And we take the corn tubes out of here, and we have a precision extruder, and we slice it, and you can use radioisotopes to determine how old the sediment is at the top and how old the sediment is at the bottom. And if you get a good core, you can extrapolate between those. And you know you've got 1990 sediment up here, and you've got 1945 sediment down here. And you can look at different things. Picture here as a graduate student, and this is what she studied. Those are graminiferans. They're single-celled animals that have a calcium carbonate shell that's just like a seashell, so you can identify them by species. And these animals tell us that low oxygen has not always been a feature of this continental shelf, and that it has worsened since the 1970s. So things that used to live there don't live there anymore, and some things are more abundant. That's a pretty good line of evidence, and it correlates with the increase in nutrients in the river. And the same thing is found in many other areas around the world. Okay, so the graph is brown shrimp catch per unit effort, and it's messy, it's variable. There's lots of reasons for the variability, but there's a decadal decrease in catch per unit effort, at least for this data set. Things can be killed, things can be forced into other areas that are not suitable habitat. They can, a shrimp moves up in the water column to get away. It's prime target for a redfish or a red snapper to eat it. The sediments become almost devoid of animals in the summer, and so when these fish move back in, there's nothing to eat. And the early life stages of many of these can't settle out and recruit. So we wrote a book on consequences of hypoxia and looked at all the different categories of animals. And it was reviewed by John Downing, who said that these are charismatically stress-dependent organisms, because everybody likes to see seals or walruses, but not worms. But these are some of my favorite organisms. And you can tell that they're stressed. You can tell that they're stressed. They're sitting on top of the surface of the sediments. You can see all the flocculent organic matter that went to the bottom. You can see dead things decomposing on the surfaces. You can see this snotty-looking sulfur-oxidizing bacteria. This anemone should be buried up in the sediments, but it's trying to get to the highest oxygen. And the fact that these organisms are there means that the fish are not going in there to eat them. So it's excluding all the fish as well. Because no self-respecting fish would miss out on some of this good stuff to eat. And then, of course, dead crabs. And this is a snail. This shows what happens to the migration of shrimp and croaker, which is a bottom-dwelling fish. When there is low oxygen, this gray and black, you don't catch anything. And the same thing over here. And the animals are pushed further offshore or further inshore or into an area that has some shallower relief. So they've basically been displaced. And what's been found more recently, because the catches of the shrimp come in size classes, you get 2030s or 3040s. So you know exactly the size class, you know where they were caught, when they were caught. And what economists have found, or just did a model and looked at the data, the long-term data, is that the ones that are caught on this side are the smaller ones, and they can catch a lot of them, but they're all very small, and the price is driven down. In this area, the shrimp will get to a larger size, but there's they're not as catchable because you have to spend time finding out where they are. And when those are caught, they have a high price, but it's such a high price that imports from overseas will come in and drive down the price. So there's definitely some economic impacts of this. Okay, let's see. Now we're going to go back upstream again for a little while. The landscape looked very different 100, 200 years ago as human beings started to cross the plains. The loss of virgin forests is seen over here, and now there's hardly any at all, although there are forests, second growth forests. The amount of land that has been drained from the 1920s to the 1960s. Originally it was just ditches, get that nasty water off that land because it's a worthless wetland. And we don't want it, we can't grow corn there. To what we do nowadays, which is build tile drains that go into ditches, that go into streams, that go into the Mississippi River. And you can see how much that's changed over time. A lot of the drainage plain of the Mississippi has been levied so that those are no longer wetlands and can no longer naturally take up the nitrogen as it moves down towards the Gulf of Mexico. And we've also, through efforts for navigation and flood control, we've levied most of the river and excluded a lot of floodplain from receiving these natural nutrients in the summer, in the spring floods. So it's not a natural system anymore, the Mississippi River itself. But all of those changes were in place by the 1950s, which is when the nitrogen started to go up in the Mississippi River. If they weren't there, the system would function more naturally, but there's no way that the Corps of Engineers and navigation districts are going to change the structure now because it's so vital to the economy of the country. We also receive more nutrients than we did, say, in the 1950s. They can be divided into point and non-point, point coming out the end of a pipe, non-point coming off the surface of the land. However, some of the tile drains actually aren't point sources because you basically have a pipe that's got something coming out of it. And you can see that most of the nitrogen delivered to the Gulf comes from the activities of corn and soybean rotation, which is what this region thrives on. And then 14% other crops, some urban population issues, some atmospheric deposition. Fossil fuel burning puts NOx up in the air, and they usually travel a long ways and then come down somewhere else. So the Ohio River Valley emissions actually end up in Long Island Sound and Chesapeake Bay. But ammonium, if it's volatilized, goes up and comes back down right away. So a lot of that is generated within the watershed, primarily from the volatilization of manure and fertilizers. Okay, phosphorus also comes primarily from crops, but there's also a lot of pasture land as well. And then 12% from cities, and that would be sewage treatment plants. And we also know where it comes from. And you can see that in this diagram here. And I don't want to pick on anybody, but you can't even see the outline of the state of Iowa in this figure, unless I'm geographically challenged. I don't think I am. So we know, so that tells us something about how we might want to deal with the issue. And it's a multi-sourced issue, but there are some things that just beg for remedy. The change over time is in this figure, and you can see the main thing that changed over time was the use of artificial fertilizers post-World War II. And the nitrate concentrations almost parallel that fertilizer use increase. So we're using way more fertilizers than we did before. We have more soybeans, alfalfa, but not the same rate of increase. Manure looks like it's similar, but it's actually in more confined animal feed operations now than in just across the landscape. And atmospheric and municipal has never been very much of a load, but not to be ignored because that's also a source. So we can do something about this. And a study done for the first hypoxia assessment by Bill Mitch and Company calculated how much nitrogen could be retained or removed through farm management, different kinds of crops, and then how much could be taken out if we actually rebuilt some of these wetlands, prairie potholes, or put riparian buffer strips along the edge of crops, or let the river drain into its natural floodplain without flooding out people or destroying navigation, and also tertiary treatment. Some of the alternative cropping systems could be no-till. It could be different kinds of crops. It could be crops with deeper roots, like Kernza, which was developed at the Land Institute. You see it in stores now. It's flour. There's a Kernza beer. So, there are other ways to get things other than the corn-based products. There are other crops that produce kernels that can be used as biofuel other than corn. And so there's just lots of things that can be done. And then the state of Louisiana thinks that if they run some of the water through the coastal wetlands, that they will naturally take out the nitrogen and solve the problem of low oxygen in the Gulf of Mexico. It's not going to work. And I'll show you some of the reasons why. We have a personal choice as well. I fill my car up with gasoline that has no ethanol. It costs more, but it's more efficient. I get better gas mileage, and it doesn't generate as many greenhouse gases. Our diet, other than what I had for dinner tonight, can make a difference on how much land we till and how much fertilizers we apply. If you're growing wheat, the roots are much deeper, much longer, and they hold on to the moisture much better. So this is fertilizer use based on 2002 Bob Howard's work that shows if it's business as usual, it's going to be those blue triangles, and that means it's going to go up. And if we increase our grain exports, it's going to go up even more. If it's a Swedish diet, which has more fish in it and more wheat in it, it'll kind of stay level. And then if it's a Mediterranean diet like pasta or vegetables, olives, more olives, pasta, more olives, then you could make a difference. So our personal choices about what we eat can make a difference in, if everybody bought into this, make some changes in societal uses of commodities. And if that doesn't work, then you can always eat more fish. However, as a marine biologist, I know that many fish populations are overfished. So, solution, eat more pasta and olives and more olives. Okay, so where are all these coastal hypoxic areas? Well, they're mostly in developed countries, Europe, North America. but they're starting to spread more and more around the globe. And when Diaz and Rosenberg did their first accounting, there were about 100 that they could identify in the literature, and now there's over 500 of these things. And they're becoming more and more prevalent, and in areas where they didn't used to be observed, such as in coral reefs. So the corals don't have a hard enough time with ocean acidification and warming, then hypoxia can also affect them. I gave a talk in Argentina at where the river Paraná drains into the Atlantic in 1989. And I was told that South American rivers are too large to have problems like the Mississippi. And now there are all these dots along this coast in particular. Concepcion Harbor has always had low oxygen because it gets stagnant and it just doesn't get turned over very quickly. So they are increasing. They increased in the 50s to the 60s to the 70s in developed countries, and they're starting to show up more and more in developing nations from the 1980s to present. So they're learning to make the same mistakes we made. And if we keep making the same mistakes we've made, then nobody's ever going to learn. So we need to try to take care of our carbon footprint and our nitrogen footprint and try to do better as a representative of society who wants to maintain a good livelihood for themselves and their grandchildren. The area of low oxygen in the Gulf is getting larger and larger, but there are a lot of variability because hurricanes will come through. This was the, This was the 2010 was a high flow year, and it was also the year of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. This was a drought. This was a drought. This one, 1988, it developed as always, but the river flow dropped in the summer, so there was no more layering of this water, so the oxygen could get to the bottom. ND normally, ND normally in science means no data, but in 1989 it stood for no dollars, so we didn't have enough money to go offshore. And I usually put an S on the end of this. NBS is because NOAA forced me onto a vessel that didn't work, so we didn't go, and I just, NDS in that case is no damn ship. But we've made progress. We pulled all this information together. We started basically assessing, and at this point, when we started this, we had about 12 years worth of data. And it was consistent from year to year. So then we put together the synthesis, and then we developed an action plan. This is state, federal task force coming up with this. And it was done in January 2001, sat on the desk of, was delivered to the desk of President Clinton. And then it ended up on the desk later that month, on the desk of President Bush. And it wasn't going very far. But Christine Todd Whitman, who was a former governor of the state of New Jersey, was the new EPA administrator. And we had a conference in 2000, and she was a plenary speaker, and she's up there, I'm sure, staring down at me. But she said, you know, I just really wish whoever's doing this would not call this comparable to the state of New Jersey anymore. Pick any state, any other state, Massachusetts, Delaware, just don't compare it to New Jersey. But what got this thing rolling, I like to take credit for, in a little way. I went to a retirement party for somebody at EPA, specifically went, and she was there, and I walked up to her. Hi, Nancy Rabelais, Louisiana. Dead Zone, New Jersey. And it moved at that point. So we have state, federal, tribal task force to come up with recommendations. Their recommendations were to reduce the size below 5,000 square kilometers by the year 2015, restore and protect waters of the basins, and improve social and economic conditions. And at that point, we estimated that about 30% would have to be reduced to meet that goal. And it might have worked, but we revised. And then there was a witch hunt by EPA, but it was forced by different people in EPA to reassess the science after about 10 years. And they basically reinforced the science, said tackle nitrogen and phosphorus, and it's, by the way, it's going to take about a 45% reduction now. So that was strengthened. But the last time the plan was redone in 2008, and then there was one more recently. The time for the goal was extended to 2035 because in the year 2015 there had been no change to the size of the area of low oxygen. And the states now have, most of them have some sort of a nutrient management plan that they are tracking progress on. So that's something, that's good. Some states are doing really good jobs, like the one at the very top of the watershed. And some are not doing as good a job like the one at the bottom of the watershed. But we actually get most of ours from elsewhere, so it's not my fault. And I mentioned earlier, these are ways to, I'm just having such a fun time, I'm not even paying attention to the time. Okay. That some of it could be taken through coastal wetlands. But when we started developing oil and gas, we started digging canals, and there would be a drilling platform at the end of one of those canals, and you can see some more of these here. Well, over the years, this is what we've done to our landscape in coastal Louisiana. And those canals prevent water flow and sediment flow, and just destroys the marshes. There are ways to fix these, and it takes landowner consent and money, but you can actually backfill these things. And because most of them have some sort of elevated, this is a disaster, but you can backfill these and they start to become natural after a while. But instead, the state of Louisiana wants to put a lot of fresh water from the Mississippi River into the area to build wetlands. I didn't say that, the wetland loss is consistent with the canal density. The more canals you build, the more wetland loss you're going to have. So in theory, if you try to put them back together, you might could do something. But then we had our other resource, our oil and gas resource, go crazy in April of 2010. The loss of life, burning of the platform, sinking of the platform, all of this oil and dispersant residue here. This is the wellhead, and this is the oil and the natural gas spewing out. Second largest oil spill in the world, the other one being in one of the Iraq wars. So things got interesting as the oil started getting closer to the shore, which is why they were putting the dispersants in the depth, with the theory that dispersing the oil in smaller droplets goes into evaporation and other chemical and oxidative forces to keep some of it from getting into the wetlands. But get into the wetlands it did. And you can see some of the results here. And you can also see that the berms that they put around, the floating berms that they put around to keep the oil out, actually trapped the oil and held it in place. And one of the issues, since we're talking about coastal erosion, is that oiled shorelines that got oiled have eroded at a much faster rate than other wetland shorelines. So we've aggravated the situation of an already degraded wetland. And just to show you a little bit of fun that we had in Cocodrie while I was director, we went from a 300-member community, fishers, shrimpers, crabbers, to about 30,000 people a day because there was a BP op center at the end of the road. And they used to feed people in these big tents. They also started building a place for people to live until they found out they put it over a natural gas pipeline. They decided they wouldn't do that. The shrimpers weren't allowed to shrimp, and they were hauling boom offshore, and this is oil. And the governor came to visit, that's why I say view from the tower. The governor came to visit Blumcon and go out and have press releases and all. And it was a big deal for people to come and have their picture taken with the governor, and there I am. And there's our Governor Bobby Jindal. And he did cut my budget for next year. Anyway, that wasn't very fun. And there was also fear that the oil would lead to making a worse or bigger dead zone that summer. And there are some lower oxygen areas, what we call oxygen minimum layers, deeper in the Gulf of Mexico, but they don't even approach the low levels that continental shelf rim does. And we also had about 26 years worth of data up to that point. And so we took the 2010 and 11 and 12, put it with the other big data set, and there was no difference in what were the factors important in developing low oxygen that year than any other year. That doesn't prove it had an effect. It doesn't prove it didn't have an effect. It just proves that it was the same as all the other years. So that's some research we got involved in. So how do you destroy a damaged ecosystem after an unprecedented oil spill? Well, it's going to be difficult, but there are ways that you can restore. These are brine pits right here, and they put the oil and gas in water. The water would evaporate, and then there'd be, we're very oily, salty, vanadium, barium, all kinds of nasty chemicals in there. We can make some progress. So there's a lot of competing uses for the Mississippi River, and it also carries a high pollutant load into the Gulf of Mexico. But it doesn't have as much sediment as it used to have. After building all the dams on Missouri, the sediment supply basically dropped in half. And the sediments that were retained upstream were more the sandier, heavier sediments, and so we're getting mostly silts. The lighter sediments in the Gulf now is not building as much. Nitrogen's gone up. Sea level will rise. I'm sure it's not caused by climate change, because that doesn't happen in Louisiana. But sea level will rise, and they're finally looking at that as an issue to build into their coastal master plan rather than ignoring it. So that's progress. We all know the nitrogen cycle. Yes, thing that you avoided studying in agronomy class. But there's another nitrogen cycle. And this nitrogen cycle has, the nitrogen molecules have dollars on each side, so I guess it would be in the nitro-di-dollar nitrogen molecule. So these are nitrols. The fertilizer is made in, mostly until recently, in Louisiana between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. It gets shipped up the river in barges. Oh man. can be such a good sentence. There's that kid. All right, so these nitrogen molecules that have dollars on them are made in the lower Mississippi River Basin because of the cheap natural gas that Louisiana could generate to generate the heat that was needed to make the anhydrous ammonia. So it goes up the river, it goes on to the land, it goes into corn, corn goes into hogs, all the way over to Utah, also in South Carolina. What else happens? There's night trawlers coming from the Congress to the Midwest in the form of subsidies, but I don't see any night trawlers flowing in this direction. And also, phosphorus is mined in Florida, barged across the Gulf, put into fertilizers, goes back up, comes back down. But P dollars doesn't sound very good, so I just like to talk about night trawlers. So anyway, in this vicious cycle here, so there's an economy that drives agriculture. There are many things that are just out of the control of many farmers because they have to buy equipment, they have to get loans, and world markets often drive the prices of much of this, and there's not much leeway for somebody. But there are a lot of farmers making differences right now with different types of cropping, different types of crops. So in the future, we will have climate change. We're having it right now. More and more areas of the world's ocean are deficient in oxygen because the water's warmer, and that holds less oxygen. Biofuels, like I said, I don't put ethanol in my car. People will continue to increase the population, maybe not as much in the Western Hemisphere as in Asia, South India, and other places in the world. And with more and more use of fossil fuels, we're going to keep increasing atmospheric deposition, which is going to come back down and cause eutrophication, harmful algal blooms, and low oxygen areas. So this isn't a call to arms, but it's a call to that we know some things that we can do individually to make a difference. And if we convince enough other people, then we can maybe make a difference with them as well. And hopefully our economies in the Midwest and in the Gulf of Mexico can be sustained further into the future. Thank you very much.
So we have microphones on the side for those of you that would like to ask questions.
There's no cookies out there.
Yeah. Please stay. So avail yourself of the microphones. Nancy will answer questions. It's on.
You can hear me.
Yeah.
The nutrient reduction suggestion that we have here in Iowa, that I believe is being adopted by 4 or 5 other states, do you have any hope that this suggestion will alleviate anything in the bill?
If the suggestion is sufficient enough to reduce nitrogen, then yes. I don't know what the plan is for Iowa. Haven't seen their plan. Louisiana just wants to put it in the wetlands, which, by the way, with the fertilized wetlands, over-fertilizing, you're going to kill them. So I don't know what Iowa's plan is. But if it's a good plan, it'll work. Yes, sir.
I've looked at the nutrient reduction strategy. It's to reduce nitrogen phosphorus by 45%, but it's totally voluntary.
Yes.
There's no standards to follow through to make sure that you're actually reducing those nutrients. And not only that, much of the practices that are in the strategy are actually enabling us to continue our production agriculture as it exists now, large scale, corn, soybean, row crop, with confined animal feeding operations receiving the benefit of those cheap grains.
Okay, thank you for your statement.
Is this on? Yeah, I had a question on, I guess I'd encourage you to look at your research on the major decision on not using ethanol, because the latest study I've seen from Oak Ridge National Laboratory suggests that greenhouse gases are reduced by corn ethanol by about 20 to 50% relative to gasoline. When you look at life expectancies,
Okay, all right.
cellulosic ethanol is even over 100%. So I guess if you're going to make those kinds of statements, it'd be nice to know what kind of research you're basing it on.
I don't have my reference with me, but I will go look at it because
Okay.
that's in some of my other work.
The second question I have is some of the recent analysis that I've seen would suggest that the cheapest price of natural gas is going to move from the Henry Hub up to the Midwest because of all of the additional natural gas reserves in Canada and also further east. And
Right.
I guess Louisiana may no longer be the cheapest source of natural gas.
That's correct.
Thank you so much for your talk. Do you have a dollar number for how much Louisiana loses every year through the dead zone?
No. I do know that the fishing industry is worth $2 billion and the agricultural industry in the Midwest is worth $92 billion.
My second question is, do you think the state of Louisiana will ever sue another state over the dead zone?
No. I
Ask
know
why.
they won't. At least not given the past and potentially future political leadership in the state.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
One of the suggestions that I have seen is a major reverse osmosis treatment of the Mississippi River water as it comes in, I believe it's on the north coast or after the last input from another river on the north edge of the state. Would reverse osmosis to take if it could be financially done, be a good solution to reduce the nitrates in your judgment?
I don't think I'm qualified to answer that question. That would be below the confluence of the Ohio, which is the last major tributary. I don't know the physics of the river at that point and how anything could be put in place against the flow of the river. I just don't know enough about
I
that.
think the last major river to come in comes from the west.
Well, the Missouri brings in,
But just on
most of the
north-
water comes from the Upper Miss and the Ohio, and much less from the Missouri. And the Missouri is the source of the sediments as opposed to the other two. Well, relative proportions.
Why is that in your judgment?
That is part of the geology of the land and how it was formed over many eons. And where the weather systems are. That's just the way the river is. Okay, do we really have cookies? No. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for the presentation. That was good. I've been watching your research develop over the last 20 years of my career and watching the dead zone increase. One thing that we've noticed is it seems that the east and west edges of the dead zone that you're measuring seems to be truncated. And so the question is it bigger than what the figure that you're actually measuring? Are you running out of time to measure it? If it is bigger than what you're measuring, how much bigger do you think it is?
Okay. The map that I showed you had data past where the low oxygen was. So that's as far as it went. In 2017, the NDS year, no, that was 2016, we did not get to finish the cruise. So I don't know how large it would have been, but based on my instinct and looking at the data, we might have added on 1,000 square kilometers and probably not much more. Because the winds have started pushing the water mass back. And you could see the deepening of the freshwater layer. So you can see the physics working against its formation. Yeah, so sometimes, I mean, I used to get 5 days funding, and that was not enough. I finally got up to 8 days, and then this last year, that still wasn't enough because it was so large.
One other suggestion that I have seen is using aeration towers to pump oxygen down into the lake. Do you see that as a viable possibility, assuming cost effectiveness, some cost effectiveness?
You mean a lake like Lake Erie or the Gulf of Mexico?
The Gulf of Mexico.
Okay. I've done the calculations, and I also worked with a small business once to see if we could build some kind of a structure that would aerate. But it would, okay. The main thing is you would have to put them all over the Gulf of Mexico.
Sure.
You just can't aerate in one place,
Sure.
which would make it prohibitively expensive. And it would also disrupt fishing, oil and gas industry, transport, and all other kinds of economic activities. And so I don't think it would ever be permitted by the Coast Guard.
One of Iowa's water companies, the one that supplies Des Moines and the environs, has purchased some very expensive equipment to remove nitrates from the water so that it will be potable and won't create problems for babies and that sort of thing. And I wonder, since they were willing to invest that kind of money, would Louisiana be willing to invest in the removal equipment to take it out of the water there at the Delta and then just sell the nitrogen back to the farmers here in the Midwest?
That's a difficult economic model, if I could categorize that. Louisiana doesn't think it's got a problem, so it's not going to pay you for anything. That's a little too facetious, I'm sorry. The best way to remove the nitrogen is when it's at the highest concentration at its source. Once it gets down to where it's leaving the lower river, it's not as high as it was, but it's still high enough to make a difference. So I have no answer for that.
I was wondering, is there like a projected point of no return for the area that's like most affected right now?
All right, where the low oxygen can occur in the Gulf is limited by the physiography of the Gulf. In other words, you're not going to have the fresh water go all the way to South Texas. So it's going to be in the northern Gulf. As the water gets further away from the river, it loses more of its nutrients. So there's not as much nutrient delivery in further downstream areas. The density difference from the surface to the bottom as you go out into deeper waters is not as intense. So low oxygen is less likely to occur there. So there are physical reasons why it can't engulf the whole Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah, but like for like the ecosystems in the water there, like you said that, you know, species get displaced and it's affecting the growth of certain things that people use for economic purposes. Like, is there a point where, you would expect that you can't bring those back, or, you know, you can't get the shrimp to come back, or the fish to
Right.
come back.
The Gulf is incredibly resilient, and shrimp spawn millions of eggs, and there's pretty high recruitment. There's pretty high capture as well. It's not an overfished industry, and it's holding its own. So I'm not sure. That's not the economic smoking gun that has been figured out. The one that's just most recently been documented well is the price of the shrimp and what it means to the people who go out to capture them. One more.
I believe you said, if I recall correctly, that the economic impact of shrimping and fishing to Louisiana is $2 million?
$2 billion.
$2 billion. What is the contribution of the oil and gas industry?
Oh, it's much higher, and it's higher than the agricultural 92 billion. Yeah. There's shrimpers want to keep farming the sea, and farmers want to keep farming the land. We just have to find a balance somehow. And a good example of grassroots activity is there are farmers from Wisconsin who go to Cocodrie, where I work at the Marine Lab, every summer and bring steaks. Well, it's in the fall. It's when they can get down there. And bring steaks and potatoes and corn on the cob and feed the shrimpers. And then in the winter, the shrimpers go up to Wisconsin and bring ingredients for corn and shrimp bisque, where they bring so that's a really good way of transferring information, I think. And there's usually some beer.
Let's give Nancy, yeah. Thanks so much for a great talk. Nancy?